So welcome everybody. This is a session that is particularly in our heart because it's one of the topics that we thought when we organized together with the World Economic Forum this E15 initiative that we should try to keep in mind as one that would need a lot of help in the years to come, just to put it in very simple terms. Now, we saw back in 2012, 13, or so on, so in the post-crisis years, how countries started a very agitated debate on their productive strategies, and particularly what instruments to bring back. Some of them put it that way, what new instruments to create to try to generate better industrial capacity. And then that all, of course, had to do with issues related to the changes in the global economy, the digitization of economies, servicification of economies, particularly of industry and manufacturing, additional to the servicification itself, the growing role, increasing role of services in economies, and then, of course, the disruption of the whole digital environment, and even in the agricultural sector as well. So, all that had to do, I was saying, with global markets, with opening. Some of the anxieties had to do, of course, with the impacts, many of them, the impact of what is called globalization more generally, but particularly the understanding, too, in many quarters, in that sense, a good understanding that those impacts had more to do with shortages and shortcomings of institutions, of policies at the domestic level. So how to, again, come up with institutional policy frameworks that could reinvigorate not only manufacturing, but generally productive capacity. That's what this topic is about. Now, post-Uruguay round, and particularly with the entrance of China to the WTO, the rapid insertion of China into global markets, there's also a tendency of many to think about deindustrialization particularly, and this is mostly in the South, but as you've seen also in certain pockets of OECD countries, to blame it on those open policies, and then what's on the table today, the ability of the multilateral system to govern over practices, including what USTR Ambassador Lighthizer has called repeatedly a wild state capitalism on the part of China. So the question there again is, with new frameworks on policy to reinvigorate productive capacity, what type of frameworks for trade and investment do we need? That's simply the question that we want to look into. A bit of introduction to where we're coming from in terms of the generation of knowledge on this area. ICTSD, as I said before, joined with the World Economic Forum to organize the E15. You probably have heard about the E15, put together about 400 experts to look at these things. There was a group that looked specifically at this question on industrial policy with brilliant membership, and which produced a set of recommendations that is available to everybody and a set of reflections on this whole theme. Today we're going to have a great panel of speakers. You have their CVs, so I won't take time presenting them to the audience now. We have Daniel Gomez Gaviria, who is Senior Economist and Trade and Competitiveness with the World Bank. Daniel has been working also at the World Economic Forum on global issues. Mario Cimoli, who is in the region the dean on these matters, working with the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, the ECLEC, for many years. Jingxia, who is a colleague of ours, I would say, with as now dean of the School of Law at UIBE in Beijing, which is our partner institution and where we have, where we host the ICTSD offices in Beijing. Rebecca Liao, who is Vice President of Business Development and Strategy of a school chain, and we're very much looking forward to hearing about Rebecca's business models and her entrepreneurship, I understand, particularly in Brazil. Colette van der Ven, who is with Sidley and Austin, an international trade law practice, very much focused on WTO issues, but Colette's heart is really on the issues of industrial policy and economic activity, particularly in development and in Africa. And Gustavo Zentner, who is president of the International Point of Commerce of the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters Association. So with that panel, what I'm going to do is really turn to the panelists with a very simple question. Thinking about the industrial policies of the past, those that made the life of famous economists from Argentina and others in the developing world, but that were later on very much responsibilized for reaching levels of exhaustion in economic growth and development in some of these regions, particularly in Latin America. Thinking about those policies, thinking about, again, those phenomena of fragmentation of production through value chains, through diversification, digitization. What is, and then obviously the frameworks that we have in place in the WTO, but those that we really think are ideal in a future world that faces challenges of sustainability, climate change, low carbon strategies, and so on. What is different between the old industrial policy and what we're calling new industrial policy? Simple question, and then go one by one, and then we can come back into a debate. Daniel, when we start with you.
Okay, perfect. Ricardo, thank you very much. Thank you very much to ICTSD for the invitation and for the great topic. I think it's a great place to be talking about this because of the legacy of industrial policies that we have, and kind of the red flag that shows us that industrial policy, even if we think it's necessary, is hard to implement. It's a hard policy to implement. It's even a dangerous policy to implement. What do I mean by dangerous policy? I think that we do have a very checkered past of industrial policy where there was some limited success in terms of generating new growth sectors, in terms of generating new activity in the region. But clearly, it introduced also a set of distortions that gave way to rent-seeking, to capture, to lobbyism, to a whole bunch of political economy problems that I think are at the heart of the implementation of industrial policies. So how do I like to think about industrial policies nowadays? I think that the first thing to realize is that is that we have to start thinking beyond manufacturing alone, right? Because of all these dynamics in global production and global trade, we know that the definition between manufacturing services is blurring, right? So, and additionally, the concept of deindustrialization also has to be looked at with care. No, we know that that a stylized fact of development is that we see these changing participation of sectors, with agriculture falling, services increasing as a share of GDP, and manufacturing following this humped shape pattern, and that's kind of the normal pattern of development. So how can we distinguish between this normal deindustrialization due to the development and premature or undesirable deindustrialization? And how can we base our new interventions in industrial policy based on that fact? So I think that that's important because we see lots of governments, lots of pressure groups, interest groups calling for different types of interventions based on this fact, that we are losing share as a percentage in GDP. I'm not convinced that's a very good reason for industrial policy, and that's why I think that it's very important to reach this new consensus, which I think has been building for the last at least 10 years in terms of what good industrial policy means. What does it mean? I think that the rationale for industrial policy is still, and can be found within the orthodoxy of economics in a certain sense, right? Mm-hmm. I think that we'd have to start from the observation of market failures that have to be addressed with specific instruments. Those instruments are vulnerable to a certain extent to government failures. So which are the sets of instruments that solve market failures and that are most robust to political economy problems of the past? So that's what I think will ultimately difference these new industrial policies from the old industrial policies of the 60s, of the 70s. What type of market failures am I talking about? There, I think that we can be a bit more broad, right? It's not only the normal information asymmetries, the infant industry arguments could be arguably a type of market failure. I think it's a lot broader to encompass problems of coordination within the private sector. So it could be interpreted as a type of information asymmetry, but it encompasses also a whole bunch of problems of coordination that will ultimately address those political economy problems. For instance, I think that at the heart of these new industrial policies is then the issue of identifying and solving market failures with a new set of instruments that are both horizontal, transversal, so the typical 90s Washington consensus type of instruments, but also vertical interventions. And with what type of instruments? With public goods. So I think there's a new emphasis on providing public goods that are both horizontal and specific to sectors, and market interventions that are horizontal, that can be things like, let's think about subsidies for innovation, things that solve some type of market failure, but that are not as subject to lobbying and to sector-specific interest groups. So I like to think in terms. I agree with my colleagues at the IDB in terms of thinking. Thinking about industrial policy in terms of the matrix of a horizontal, vertical, public goods, and market intervention type of space. And each of these instruments, each of those quadrants, will be subject to different types of government failures. So that's where the big challenge lies. What are the type of institutions and the challenges for this new industrial policy? I think that at the core is a problem of coordination between government agencies. Between government agencies at the national levels, between government at the national and subnational levels, and between the public and the private sector, right? So new industrial policies are about having this new structured dialogue between the private sector, the business community, and governments to be able to identify where to prioritize. So it's not a matter of choosing winners. I think we have to move away from that narrative of industrial policy about choosing winners. I think it's more about how to use these instruments, solving these coordination problems, to provide the environment that allows entrepreneurs and allows the private sector to self-discover these new sectors of growth, and to have the public sector complements the public goods that are necessary to boost those type of activities. So identifying market failures, identifying instruments, solving coordination problems, facilitating bottom-up identification of new growth sectors, and how do we achieve this? So I think that we have some very good examples. I think that in Latin America, there are examples of countries trying to implement national competitiveness systems, productive transformation policies that are helping to achieve all of these results. I think that the example of Malaysia, the Pemandu in Malaysia, is a very nice example of how to bring these ideas to the field in a sense. I think that the smart specialization strategies analyzed and put forward by the European Commission are a good example of how to implement these ideas. And the fourth example that I think is worth mentioning, that is both a tool to implement industrial policy, but also a way to conceptualize it, is all the cluster ideas, right? Cluster policies, which at the end of the day, I think is a way to achieve this coordination between the public sector and the private sector, between the local governments and local interests and the national governments. So what's going to be new with industrial policy? I think we have to be rigorous in terms of identifying, having a market failure rationale. I think some will call me overly orthodox, but I think that's a good way to be disciplined and to protect these new industrial policies from arbitrary interventions that are more subject to the political economy problems of the past. It's going to be different in the sense that it will have to be more bottom-up, and the bottom-up will be facilitated by the digital economy, digitalization, participation of SMEs in this new third wave of globalization will be a lot easier. So I think that that the scope for smart interventions is greater. I think that the information that we have available is also larger. To finish this first intervention, I really think that we do have to stick with some type of framework that is based on economics, and is with institutional mechanisms to protect from capture. I think it's very important to have sunset clauses, to have exit strategies, to be able to rationalize based on the balancing act between solving market failures and the risks of government failures, and then being able to experiment and to move forward with piloting with smart interventions that are easy to phase out. I think I'll leave it there for as first intervention.
That's excellent, Daniel. And I'll come back with sort of the trade policy layer, probably at the second part of the dialogue. But thank you, because you have introduced really all the elements, that particularly that notion of new market failures, the questions of information asymmetry, of coordination, which are absolutely critical and very little understood in many countries, but also the management of the negative and the positive spillovers. So let me turn to Mario now for a regional perspective on how Latin America is or not confronting these challenges.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, really. And welcome. I am very happy because for many of 20 years, industrial policy in Latin America was a very bad word, you know. You can say that. If you say that, you become quite a terrorist. You have to be very happy. And I'm happy, really, that industrial policy is coming again. That is I show to you, honesty, good, very good indeed, and it's a pleasure. I'm looking here in a document, and people preparing for me, and you have Sweden, production 2030, Germany, industry 4.0, China, 2030, Spain, industria conectada, USA, manufacturing USA, American first. And now, in each of these projects, there is no one, sorry about that began the background document with market failures. No one. Why we have to use that in Latin America as a concept to support industrial policy? I can't understand that. You're asking to the German people and asking to them, you have a market failure. No. This has to be a strategic. They have to be for competitive. They have to be for productivity. You have to create institution. And you actually do that to the German people. They don't have any words in the document supporting that market failure. If you read the China's program, 2030, there, also there, you think that the industrial policy in China is based on market failure? No, please, sorry, I am happy that this war is coming now, but really, I want to be important. And most of these countries, the successful industrial was the old industrial policy, not a new one. Of course, now it's different. I agree with that. But why is different the industrial policy today? Not because you have an intervention of the state. Intervention of the state you have in the United States, you have in Europe, you have in China, you have in all of these countries. It's very strategic, very strong, and very hard. Why is different today? I think there is 3 points. It's not this about the theoretical point. First one, there is not more definition of sector. Okay? If you take the automobile sector is a sector. It's a manufacturing, it's services, it's ICT, it's connectivity on the road, it's connectivity on the platform. It's a very complex. We don't have more definition of sector. Policies that you need have to be really horizontal, but have to be to take a more open view on how policy have to be implemented. That is an important point. Because sector don't have more the tradition definition of sector. This is the first point. That is have to be industrial policy different. And people understand that, because if you have German industry, German policy 4.0 on the Chinese policy recently, most of them combined with no definition of sector. Is more larger, is more ICT, is more network. This is the first point that is important. The second one, I think, is different. Why industrial policy has to be different? Sector is different. The second one is, what is market today? You have ICT platform. Is market or network? Is network by hierarchy or this other type of processes? If you take policy today, you have market, of course, but you have networks also. Platform and moved on network. Network has hierarchy. Hierarchy have to be governance. It's completely different. And I think it's difficult to define policy in this new concept. And the third one that I believe that is really important is about the definition, the tangible versus intangible. You have today, you can speak about tangible products that's more important, intangible, bytes, services, and so on. I think intangible is taking more part of the market. It's taking important part of trade. It's taking more important part of added value. It's completely different. Now, I think not because you have a new industrial policy, so you have to. It's because it's different the subject today, because technological change, industrial policy, organization of production, business model is completely new. And we think that there is 3 important elements to elaborate and to rethink and policy. That's, for my reason, is new. Not because you don't have the intervention of the state, but because it's new. Sectors, there is not more clear definition of what sector is about today, not clearly. Many times you have a very complex process to define sector, and you have manufacturing. What is today? Manufacturing is really manufacturing, or is services? Services is knowledge. Knowledge is byte. It's different. It's completely another thing. The second one that is important, market and network. You don't know that today policy, and you take regulation and competence policy has an important part of industrial policy. Today, most important problem is to have the governance of networks, of platform, on different level of platform. Network versus market. And the third one, I think, is important because today we have more intangible products, processes that are tangible ones. That is the reason that we have to rethink industrial policy. Not because industrial policy has to be different. There is no country around the world that increases productivity without industrial policy. Tell me one. Europe, Japan, China, that make it really catching up. It has a more strong industrial policy that you have around the world. Every time that the United States created a firm, Google, they created another one that's Boo. The United States created another firm, they created another one, and that's its market failure. Now, that is the point. I think it's important to elaborate that industrial policy became and remain an important aspect. But it's not different because you don't need industrial policy. You have to rethink. It's because the context of production processes, business model, structure of market is completely different. Of course, this has an enormous impact on trade. And this isn't the second one. It's coming later.
But just before I let you get off there. So tell us quickly, in your opinion, where's Latin America?
Latin America is a context. During the 80s and 90s, honestly, industrial policy was a very bad war. There was the ministers in this region that said the best industrial policy is to have no industrial policy at all. And Latin America make an enormous mistake too, that is not clearly. But today they are recovering industrial policy in more practical way. Take the case of Chile, take the case of Corfu, take the case of today in Argentina too. industrial policy is coming back, and probably more efficient than it in the past. But we have lost more than 20 years. This is my word. We do it. Bad policy sometimes, but many times we did nothing. You have to. I give one variable. You know how is the expenditure on research and development in Latin America on GDP is 0.4. It's quite nothing. And that is part of industrial policy. We need more than that.
Okay, we'll come back to some of that. Jingxia,
Thanks, Ricardo.
Just to frame what you're going to say, try to give some flow to the conversation. We've talked about China very much. You just heard Mario.
Yeah.
You have done a great deal of research on Chinese policies, and particularly from the perspective of how they have changed in the years of membership with the WTO. So can you talk a little bit about that experience, but also about what may have been launched already today or will be launched tomorrow here, which is this new idea of the EWTO, and so the notion that China is preparing to transit from fast-paced industrialization to now become a digitalized world powered in the way that it has been. That's the words that have been used to announce it.
Thanks, Ricardo. Let me first thank ICTSD for organizing this great event and having me here. So I will use several minutes to share with you the situation with in China with respect to our latest version of industry policy. As we all know here, that industry policy is a highly sensitive topic. Imposed or exercised in many countries, although people in different countries have different perspective in terms of the function or real outcome of industry policy can have. Like in continental Europe and particularly in Asia, including China, faith seems to be in the government's ability to steer or transfer companies into industries they might otherwise avoid. But in the US and UK, governments have a relatively lousy record in picking winners in fast-evolving markets, and therefore faith tends to supplanted by deep doubts. Since we just talk about the relationship between industry policy and market failure, I would like to say that industry policy can get some results in terms of addressing market failure, but my understanding seems to be that industry policy, particularly in the situation in China, is not at least not all about market failure. Industry policy can get some result, especially for projects where private capital is not interested in, or barriers to entry are very high. The sector has fewer players and a singular focus, like the commercial aircraft developed in recent years, so-called C919, and the US moon landing. So yes, in this sense, American practice industry policy as well. China is very unique in terms of the breadth and heft of industry policy. For many years, China has relied on a state-driven industry policy to structure its economy. In recent years, among other things, Chinese government has long been concerned that the country's economy is still too concentrated in fairly low-end manufacturing. Particularly, China does not want to stuck forever as a so-called original equipment manufacturer, OEM. So there is an urgent need for China to move from past catch-up industrialization strategies and push industry policy into global innovation and science technology research and industry development. So against this backdrop, China has been recently rolling out a new generation of policies directed at a range of advanced sectors. This partly mentioned by Ricardo just now. In 2015, China announced the so-called Made in China 2025, not 2030, I must correct you, plan. This plan first was unveiled in the government work report delivered in March 2015 by our Premier Li Keqiang. The State Council then released a guidelines which focused on 5 key projects and 10 key fields. The plan covers the manufacturing of aircraft, robots, electric cars, rail equipment, ships, and agriculture machinery. But this plan does put key technologies as a priority on its agenda, including independent research and development, innovative development in fields such as new materials, and robots is to be accelerated. China also attempts to develop so-called strategic emerging industries, SEI, and accelerate research and development on and commercialization of new materials, artificial intelligence, integrate circuits, biopharmacy, 5G, mobile communication, and other technologies, and develop industry clusters in these fields. For short, Made in China, Make 2025, as a crucial part of supply-side structural reform, is vital to moving Chinese economy up the global value chain. But the key is to exploit advantages of China's domestic market and human resources, as well as further promotion of basic research and innovation. As a national manufacturing upgrading strategy reaches implementation stage, a series of supporting policies to facilitate Make 2025 are being rolling out as well. In 2016, 5-year plans on strategic emerging industries were formed. 8 SEI are highlighted, including energy serving, environmental protection, next generation IT, biotechnology, advanced manufacturing, new materials, and new energy vehicle, digital creative industries, and high-tech services. So the 13th 5-year plan and the SEI catalog work together with Made in China 2025, trying to shape outcome in important parts of Chinese economy. Also looking beyond this picture, we see there are 3 macro-techno industry strategies defining China's technological trajectory, which includes the so-called revitalization of the Northeast, which has not been successful thus far. Developed the West and the rise of Central China. Also very important, adding to these plans are the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, which includes capacity cooperation, designing to offshore exercise industry capacity. Made in China 2025 sets up about very broad targets, as I mentioned just now. And also we note the timing is very delicate as well. President Trump had campaigned about confronting China on trade and currency issues. China is also laying the legal framework for challenging at the WTO, refusing by the United States and the EU to accept that China is a market economy for purpose of anti-dumping trade cases. So industry policy imposed recently in China does relate to global trade and investment issues. I will come back to this later if I have time to reflect on China's new industry policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jingxia. Rebecca?
Yes.
So we bring you in, and you are very active for what little I understand that you do on blockchain technologies and trying to bring them to this region in particular. So would you like to
Yes,
explain
absolutely.
a bit from your perspective?
Absolutely. So thank you very much, Ricardo, and thank you to ICTSD for having me and for putting this panel together. And so I assume that I'm here to give a bit of the private sector perspective on this.
Right.
From the private sector's perspective, I would say that industrial policy is a fact of life. If the government decides that heavy manufacturing is a priority, then obviously companies that work in those sectors will react accordingly. I think what is more broadly applicable to the entire private sector is processes, and processes are direct results of or direct consequences of market failures that we've been referring to. And so at SKU-Chain, but more broadly for the blockchain community and the technology community that's looking at addressing market failures within industrial policy or within trade policy, it's important to look at how we can improve these processes so that we remove the market failures and then we don't have the necessity of using an instrument like industrial policy where clearly there are winners and there are losers and there are going to be market distorting effects that may not be intended. So with that, I would say that there are probably three main areas that technology addresses and in which technology seeks a partner in trade policy, industrial policy, economic policy in general. And those three areas are trade facilitation, which I know is a huge topic for the WTO, harmonization of regional trade agreements, preferential trade agreements, as well as reform of the tariff regime to more accurately reflect how trade is conducted nowadays, which is not so much point-to-point between countries, but in these global value chains. So I'm going to start with preferential trade agreements because this is a long-term objective, and I know that this has been on the map for trade policy as well as the WTO for decades. I know that there is a lot of discussion within the WTO. What is our place now that all these regional trade agreements are being formed and they seem to be more efficacious than trade policy coming directly from a huge multilateral body like the WTO? So what I can tell you is that preferential trade agreements lead to deepening of global value chain relationships between countries. When you have these trade agreements forming, what that means is that the industries within these countries that are a part of that agreement are going to start reshaping their value chains so that they can take advantage of the policies within these agreements. That's a good thing. What that means, though, is that countries that are outside of these preferential trade agreements are sort of on the outside looking in. They don't see the benefits of this. And how that translates in real terms is that a lot of developing market economies are left out of global value chains altogether. And that's definitely a social need that needs to be addressed. The other aspect of preferential trade agreements is when you have so many different agreements proliferating, I'm sure you're all familiar with the term spaghetti bowl. So you have lots of different kinds of agreements governing the same trade. And how do you harmonize all the different regulations that this trade has to comply with? It certainly enriches a lot of lawyers. I have nothing against that as a lawyer myself, but it's definitely something that can be improved with greater efficiencies. That is a long-term project, though, and I think the private sector is eager to work with multilateral bodies like the WTO to affect that project, but it is many decades long if it's ever going to be accomplished. So I want to move on to something that's maybe a little more reachable, which is what do we do about tariffs in global value chains? So what impact does a tariff have on a good that is being transferred within a global value chain? So tariffs are really meant for a regime of trade in which you have one good being exported, imported to or from another country. Very simple, point to point. In a global value chain, what happens is that you may have 10 different companies in 10 different countries providing their value add to a product before it becomes a finished good. So does that mean that when raw materials leave the first country and go to the second country for value add to be provided by the company there, that there's a tariff imposed both ways? And then when that unfinished product goes to the third country, then there's another tariff that's imposed, and so on and so forth. And so you have this layering on of extra charges, if you will, to the bill. And what that really means for global trade policy and global value chains is that all of a sudden you introduce greater risk into your value chain, and particularly in the middle. Because if you are a company that is in the middle of a global value chain, then not only do you get hit by these tariffs, but the value add that you provide to this product already suffers from some measure of price distortion along the way because there is imperfect transparency about pricing within this value chain. So you get two price distortions, if you will. You compound that with the fact that most trades nowadays, I think nearly 80%, are affected on the open account. What that means is that the supplier is going to extend payment terms to the buyer. So meaning the buyer can choose, 30, 60, 90 days to pay the bill once the goods have left the supplier's hands. This introduces significant risk to the supplier. How do they deal with it? They do it through working capital relief financing. That is of limited supply to most suppliers out there. And if a supplier is not financially healthy, then that introduces risk into the global value chain. What it also means is that it's very difficult for small, medium-sized enterprises to participate in global value chains. Most of the enterprises who can absorb this risk are larger enterprises that could count as anchor buyers themselves. So that's on the tariff front. Finally, I'll address trade facilitation. So trade facilitation, in our parlance, means automation, it means digitization, it means streamlining procedures that happen at customs, at ports, such that in order for a trade transaction to happen, you have as few barriers to it as possible. Now, from a technology perspective, it's not hard to digitize a document. It's not hard to automate execution of a document. In blockchain parlance, it's called a smart contract. It's basically a contract that you digitize and then automate execution of the terms. It's not hard to affect that technology itself. What is hard is implementing it in the real world. Because even if you can prove that this technology works, you still need a legal regime, you need a policy regime that accepts this digitization as valid evidence of a transaction. And so for those of you who follow blockchain, you've probably seen a lot of press out there about banks being involved in such transactions. You're starting to see some industry players be involved in it as well. All of these are pilots or proofs of concept. And the reason is not because the technology is not mature, it's because at what point do we say that a smart contract is a valid legal instrument? It'll hold up in any court of law. At what point do we say that a data LC is a valid letter of credit? All of these achievements need to be validated according to universal standards. Now, the industry has taken this into its hands to a certain extent. They formed consortia. I'm sure that you've seen news of that as well, where banks get together, industry gets together to form some of these standards. But really, these consortia can't do it on their own. You're starting to see that some of the incentives there when private actors who are generally competitors with one another get together and try to come up with universal standards. You need some sort of standard-setting body, like the WTO, like the ICC, to step in and facilitate the discussion. At the same time, Mario kind of touched on this, is that when you look at global value chains, it's not necessarily just the trade in goods anymore. You're looking at the trade in services. You're looking at the trade in communication. You have logistics and transport involved as well. And you need platforms that will be able to coordinate between all of this. So what does this exactly mean? Why do we care so much about trade facilitation? I think that the latest stats are that the cost would go down by about 13 to 16%, depending on the size of the economy, if you were able to digitize trade processes. That is a significant cost savings and a significant lubricant to global trade. So what is industry doing about this? Digitization is an effort that has been underway for a long time. Blockchain is sort of digitization weaponized. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with blockchain, the very simple version of it is that it is a distributed ledger, and it's completely secure. It sounds very boring, but what that means is transparency. What it means is auditability and immutability. And you can see from those different characteristics why there are so many applications of blockchain that are appropriate for the trade context. And finally, the financing piece. So the financing piece speaks directly to what happens with the price distorting functions of tariffs. I think that is something that technology has been working on as well, especially the fintech companies out there. So what does it mean for how we interact with trade and industrial policy? So I think that technology, despite what Silicon Valley says, very much looks to government as a partner. We can't do it alone. And when we come up with technological solutions to policy problems, we hope to have the government as a willing and active participant in implementing those policy solutions. So we really do hope that all the bodies that we talked to this week that are part of the global trade economic architecture will join us in affecting these trade reforms. On the finance piece, I'll say just very briefly that I think the door was really open to affect some changes in this area from Basel II and III, where you saw that trade finance was lumped in with a lot of riskier finance assets, and it caused banks to move their assets to finance those instruments as opposed to trade finance, which is a relatively risk-free transaction. I think that a lot has been done in Basel II and III to move away from that, but because you had that policy to begin with, it opened the door for a lot of fintechs to move into that area. Finally, I wanted to talk about facilitating the establishment of standards. I can't overemphasize how important this is. This has to do with the banks. It also has to do with the ICC, and the WTO obviously has a hand in this as well. But the idea there is just a very, very simple example. In your email, you see the to, from, CC, BCC columns. This is a sort of open standard that we need to agree to in order to really open up trade facilitation digitization. So with that, I'll stop for now, but those are some of the examples of how private sector is thinking about industrial and trade policy.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. So I hesitate to jump Colette and go, to skip Colette rather, and go to Gustavo and come back to Colette. Is that okay? So Gustavo, just from the Canadian perspective, if you can give us the view of the SMEs and how they're looking at Canadian industrial policy, which is particularly interesting in the past few years.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you, Ricardo, and ICTSD for the invitation and for working with us. I mean, I understand that my involvement in the panel today is to talk to you about what's happening in Canada and how are we engaging with industry and with governments, and what are we doing to ensure that there is families. So that's very important for us. We have also concluded recently establishing an open access to Europe through what we call CETA, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. That is also fantastic because it opens up our market to arguably the second or third largest economy in the world. And in addition to that, because of some decisions made by the US President related to TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we are probably championing, and I can say this because I'm not in government, I think Canada is championing this discussion or rhetoric about TPP 11, so the Trans-Pacific Partnership of 11 nations, minus the US, at their own decision. How do you translate that into industrial policy? In Canada, and I'm fascinated by being part of the panel and the research that we've done, in Canada, having a discussion about industrial policy is not a concern, does not come from a perspective of any kind of connotation of negativity. To the contrary, it sets the parameters for government and for private sector to have an intelligent discussion at the table. And I'm sorry to try and simplify it, but that's the way we view it. So I cannot imagine living in a country or an economy where you want to move forward or where you want to have some sort of logic economic development without having your legislators by your side. It seems to me that that's almost insane. What we do is open up discussions and dialogue at multiple levels of engagement in discussions, be it at the federal level, influencing through lobbying activities. We do it at the provincial level or state, depending on the country you come from, and at the municipal level. Those discussions are in around what makes sense for our families and employees as opposed to what do you, government elected official, want to accomplish. And that has put us in a position of being able to tell the government very respectfully that we need governments to come up with industrial policies that focus on things that the government of the day cannot change. No matter what the political party, you cannot change natural resources that we have. You cannot change the continuous needs for industrial development on defense and military and infrastructure and transportation. So if you think of it that way, yeah, you're able to engage in a conversation with government where you say, we need you to come to the table and create policies that will help us regulate and talk to one another and tell you, government, where we feel it's fair for us to pay taxes and where it's not. And also for us to be able to say to government, industrial policies would make sense in specific sectors that are a must, that are a given, and that are first and foremost beyond the government's control. So samples of that would be military technology and energy supply. So we tend to focus a lot in things that we can bring to the world at the world stage that no one can take away from us. And that's why you probably hear that Canada is working so hard at developing solar energy and clean sources of energy. And we're trying to not to waste a lot of time discussing why are we trying to do it, but how do we do it fast? How do we do it faster than those in China? How do we do it faster than some of our neighbors in the US? And how do we do it faster than our neighbors in Netherlands or in Germany? So from that perspective, that's the one key element where we're saying industrial policy works best when the government is dealing with natural resources and interests. The second of the 3 points that I wanted to make is policies are likely to fail when they follow rather than when they lead market. So it's counterproductive to expect that government officials or bureaucrats, with all the respect, will know what industry needs and will know exactly how to turn on a machine. And if they do, guess what? Too late. Why? Because we're embracing, almost in a passionate way, Industry 4.0. And we're dealing with artificial intelligence. And we're dealing with how do we get paid and collect in a virtual cryptocurrency reality, and how do we ask government to understand and keep up with us in the private sector so that they can build a framework for industrial policy development. So I can buy more technology faster than a regular banking transaction. And I think I'm speaking of, at this point, Ricardo, I think I'm speaking of things that have been said from a very unique perspective by other speakers, but kind of wrapping it up because it makes sense for us in Canada to be able to implement what we're preaching, and that is an open policy, expecting government to come on board on what industry requires. And my last point there is related to how likely it is for industrial policies to succeed. We feel that there are many areas where at the local or regional level, industries can identify needs for specific OEM and original equipment manufacturer or for a specific developing sector, and we have adopted what it's called supercluster. Remember discussion about let's come up with clusters. So if you look at Querétaro in Mexico, which is a place that I know very well, I do business there, and I simply love because of how they've been able to align industry and government. Well, we're now dealing with not cluster level, we're looking at superclusters, which means it's no longer about how do we manufacture something and transport it from one point of the world to the next, and it's no longer about let's build a lot of that so that when customers come knocking on the door, we can simply go to a shelf and ship it. We're now looking at additive manufacturing, supported by artificial intelligence, supported by Industry 4.0, supported by government bringing up policy to stay out of the way of business and to enable business to get its job done. And as I said, I thank you for opening up the opportunity for me to speak, and I look forward to some interaction on the Q&A.
Thank you, Gustavo. That was also very interesting and very helpful. So we go to Colette, and the reason I left Colette for the end now, just before we go to the audience, is because I know you've been working at both levels. As I said before, you've been on the ground for many years, looking at very interesting experiences in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and so you have a good knowledge of the shortcomings in institutions and policies, and particularly how they relate to your other field, which is specifically trade policy, WTO, RTAs, AGOA, so that you can introduce us then into bringing that trade policy layer into this. Colette.
Great, thank you so much, Ricardo.
And I know, Colette, I just know you well, so I trust that you can do whatever that I ask you, and magic, so that's why I took that risk.
Thank you so much. It's really my pleasure to be here. Thank you to ICTSD for organizing another terrific conference here at the sidelines of MC11. To go back to the first question that Ricardo asked, before we delve into more specific legal issues, what is new about industrial policy of the 21st century? And three things to me come to mind. That can all be summarized by one word, which is it's more complicated, or a few words, but one concept. It's a lot more complicated because old industrial policy fit into ideological boxes. It was industry protection during the 1960s and 1980s, especially in developing countries, and then it moved on to more Washington consensus style, export-oriented policies, etc. Now we're out of the ideological box because both parties seem to have realized that it's not working. So we're somewhere beyond ideology, which opens the door for a more pragmatic approach to what industrial policy should look like. So it's really quite exciting, I think, in that field. The second one is it's no longer just industrial policy, but it's inclusive and sustainable industrialization, as we learn from, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, number 9, that specifically highlights the sustained and inclusive element of this. Now, and what does that mean, sustainable industrialization? It means a lot of things, but at a minimum, I would say it means having an industrial policy not just focused on big business, big foreign businesses, for example, that are growing the economy, but also including small businesses, like we heard. It may mean environmental sustainability. It may mean some sort of ownership in the process. It can mean different things, but it's no longer just measured by the degree of expert sophistication that a country may have. And then the third that we've already heard is the global value chain dynamics, essentially. Before, a government would focus on a final product. Now, our governments focus on inserting into a value chain somewhere in the intermediate part of this chain. And that has a lot of consequences for the policy, for the law, and for a lot of other things, because on the one hand, trade here is a critical enabler. Without the value chains, many countries that don't have the capacity could previously not integrate and take advantage of some of the benefits offered by globalization. Yet on the other hand, it also risks this concept called thin industrialization. And you see this a lot in sub-Saharan African countries, for instance. As Ricardo mentioned, I have some experience with those countries. And what you see is the country enters the value chain right at the lower echelon of the chain. So this would be, for instance, assembling electronics, or this would be the textile value chain where you sew up a button as a country and then reship it out. And this is specifically facilitated by trade preferences, by special economic zones, by foreign direct investment, and you add all these elements up, and what you see are developing countries that are now increasing their exports with an enormous amount. So Kenya, for instance, in the year 2000, its garment exports were 40 million. In the year 2016, close to 400 million, all to the US, all under the African Growth and Opportunity Act. So an enormous potential to increase exports. Yet if you unpack that number, you see that the actual value added in the country is as little as 3%. So that raises the question, what is industrialization? What kind of industrialization do we want to see? And what does this mean in terms of the policies a country wants to adopt? Because if you want to integrate into the value chain, protectionism no longer works, because as we've heard, the tariffs become a huge issue. You want to make sure that you don't hurt domestic firms from integrating, and the moment you raise the import tariff of certain goods that will then be re-exported, you're losing competitiveness. Yet nothing isn't working either, as the numbers tell us. Sub-Saharan Africa is still by and large exporting raw materials and raw goods. So trade alone is not enough. Trade needs complementary domestic policies at a minimum. And I think that framing is important for us to understand perhaps where we can go in the 21st century to create more development. Now, turning it into the WTO policy space, so my other hat as a trade lawyer, so some have argued that the reason we haven't seen more industrial development in developing countries is because of the WTO or because of free trade agreements or others. I would venture to say that that is an overgeneralization at a minimum. For one, whether or not there is policy space depends on the type of policy you want to adapt, right? And as we see that it's ideologically moving towards the middle, the fact that there are more countries now that are less inclined to engage purely in protectionist measures already gives more policy space under the WTO, which is a liberalization instrument. But also, for those that do want to engage in more protectionist type measures, there's still quite a bit of space left. And in that front, policy space under the WTO really is a country-specific inquiry. For instance, more than half of sub-Saharan African countries have bound less than 40% of their tariffs. That means that should they want to raise tariffs, which, as we've seen, may not be a good idea, but should they want to do that, they can under the WTO policy space. In Latin America, it's a little bit more, there are more bound tariffs, but that's a possibility. Same with your GATT schedule. If you want to engage in certain types of performance requirements, if you haven't bound your services under GATT, then you still have a lot of space to do that. Moreover, there's a lot of exceptions. Least developed countries under the WTO are exempt from, for instance, export subsidy requirements, so they can engage in those types of policies should they have the wish to do so. And finally, the WTO's coverage is incomplete. So procurement is something, to the extent countries are not signed up to the government procurement agreement, they can engage in discriminatory measures in government procurement settings. It's a narrow scope, but it is nevertheless something they can do. And likewise, things like currency exchange manipulation is not covered, which is another typical tool we've seen that Asian countries have used. So policy space doesn't seem to be the binding constraint. What seems to be another issue, and I'll be brief, is that in addition to the de jure policy space, if you will, there's the de facto policy space. And those that talk about policy space issues almost assume that because there's a rule, countries apply it. And that assumption is incorrect. You only have to look at the amount of cases, the 500 plus cases that are at the WTO right now, to know that that is not what's happening. And then in addition, again, policy space or the de facto policy space is country specific, because no least developed country has ever been sued at the WTO. So the bite of those rules may not be quite as strong as we all like to believe. And finally, there seems to be a coordination assumption to the policy space debate, which is that if policy space really were to constrain industrial policy options, that almost assumes that the policymakers have a copy of, the Uruguay round agreements next to them when they decide on what industrial policy to adopt. I may not be a surprise to those of you working in government, but that doesn't actually happen. And there's research done about this. I myself conducted a few case studies on this, and you see by and large that those that are in charge of industrial policy making do not look to the WTO and do not even align the actual industrial policy objective with trade and investment instruments. So for me, that is where there's a lot of room to be done in understanding how trade may undermine perhaps one's position in the industrial policy and how trade can be used as a tool to help a country advance its position rather than undermine it. Thanks.
Is this not working? Yes. I'd like to now open the floor to the audience before we come back for some reflection specifically on trade policies and the frameworks, if we may. Yeah, okay, so let me, I just gathered maybe 4 or 5 interventions and then we come back. So why don't we start with Alejandro Jara, and that's out of seniority, Mauricio, so that You see, it's the most senior first. Alejandro and then Maurice.
Thank you very much.
Alejandro.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a fascinating discussion with different perspectives. The fact that industrial policy in Latin America still has a bad name is not undeserved, I would say. And I'd like to say that to the extent that, as Daniel has suggested, that if you're intervening because there's a market failure, then to my mind what you're doing, really doing is leveling the playing field. And I think that that makes economic sense. But if you go beyond that, and you go domestically, you are transferring resources from one sector to another, possibly, probably, hopefully, that is decided through a democratic process. But the people, the opportunity cost should be made apparent. We're not going to spend money on this because we're going to give it to this sector, those people, whatever it is. So that's part of the democratic game. But externally, there is industrial policy, call it what you may, this will probably have an impact on others, and it will be good for others to know what's happening and how it's going to impact their interest in that market. Unfortunately, in the WTO, we don't have the necessary transparency. Governments are very reluctant to say how they spend their monies. And secondly, we don't have good processes whereby new policies or draft of policies can be discussed in order to determine, for others to be made aware first, and for others to say what the impact is going to be. If we had those, we had better processes and better rules, maybe we could avoid a lot of conflicts that we have nowadays in this regard. And just judging by the accusations of unfairness and cheating that go around the world, I think that we have a problem here, which we clearly, I think, needs better rules and disciplines in the WTO. Thanks.
Thank you, Alejandro. Mauricio. Yep. If you want to identify yourself.
Thank you. I want to touch on something Ricardo said at the beginning, just in passing. I wonder whether new industrial policy should not address the fact that we're thinking of increasing trade, increasing production, and the world has not enough resources to keep on this trend that began at the Industrial Revolution, but with clearly the 2008 crisis is putting a light on. So new industrial policy should not take into consideration the fact that soon we will have not enough resources for all this expected growth?
That's the critical question of sustainability. So let's come back to that again. In the back, yes, I can't see very well from here, but I see there's.
Thank you. Renato Baumann from the Ministry of Planning, Brazil. We started this session discussing about market failure. According to the next 5 speakers, I think we now have come to the conclusion that there is a government failure, not a market one. And I mean by that, the very situation that we are going through right now in Latin America. We have learned about the new definitions of industrial policy. We have known from the Chinese example the distance for us to catch up. And yet this region is living right now with a very strong inflow of FDI, basically resource seeking, and not in the way Canada is doing. It's just exploiting natural resources as nature brings us. And why is this a government failure? Because we lack the signaling and the normative rules to direct investment, as much as we miss or failed to have the WTO allowing us degrees of freedom to direct investment to wherever would be more desirable from the perspective of more sustainable development process. So we are living in a situation where we are quite happy of having FDI inflow because we don't have savings, and yet this is consolidating a way of production that doesn't fit into the image that we have just learned of what should be an industrial policy right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Renato. Sherry, and I'm here, please.
Thank you very much. Sherry Stevenson, ICTSD. Very, very interesting panel. Thanks, Ricardo. I want also to pick the brains a little bit of Daniel Moore, because you gave a classic economic rationale answer for industrial policy and said it should address market failures. It should be broader, include coordination problems. But you didn't mention something that in the services area we always think about when we are looking at why governments should regulate and intervene in markets. And this is to reach that, not just to correct economic failures, but also to correct or to reach public policy goals, such as the goals that are set out in the SDGs, basically universal service obligations in the area of telecom, or universal access to schools or public health or so forth. So these require market interventions also. Are these would you call these in the guise of industrial policies? Does that come into your way of thinking? Or are you just looking at industrial policy in the context of non-social objectives, not the public policy objectives, but just correction of market failures? So I was just curious to see how far or how limited your definition went and where you put the category of policies. And then to Colette, just I was kind of fascinated by your distinction between the de jure and the de facto policy space. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on what you think, how you define de facto policy space? Thanks.
You mean whether it's a question of, it's a mindset as well, rather. Okay, I had a hand here across the table, and we have to go very quickly. Maybe this is the last. I don't see anybody else, but which is good. We need to close really sharp at 30 minutes past, so please. Okay, I also thank you very much. This was a fascinating session. Well, I am Murat Yülek, Director of Center for Industrial Policy and Development in Istanbul Commerce University. If until 1980s we have learned about government failure, after 1980s we have learned about the market failure. So it looks like both sides are making failures. So there is a point to Daniel's point. But also, just to add to your reasons, let's say, if one party among 200 countries, let's say, is, if one country conducts industrial policy, then it creates reasons for the others also to conduct policy. To give you an example, I was an IMF economist. This will be very short, responsible for an African country, and we were proposing them to liberalize the agricultural sector. And I remember in one of the meetings, the government official in that African country told me, look, you are coming from US, because IMF is based in the US. You are telling us to liberalize the agricultural sector in our country, and then you have got the Bush Farm Bill. It was those years, 2005. So if in America you have got the Farm Bill, then it creates reasons for others not to liberalize. And is it possible to have one country out of, is it possible not to have one country out of 200 that's not conducting industrial policy under different names? For example, industrial policy, you can call it defense policy, and it's still industrial policy, right? In the US, for example,
or you can call it a space policy, but it's actually, under the definitions, it's an industrial policy. So you can call an orange an apple or an apple an orange, but it doesn't change that. It's that one. My question to the whole panel, all of the, by the way, speakers were excellent. Thank you very much for putting together all these things. Maybe directly it would go to Mario or Daniel, but you know, when Mario was telling us about the three, let's say, reasons why now we have to think about it differently. Could we have, or could you perhaps, or other speakers, comment on two different additional aspects? One is, you know, some people call it horizontal and vertical, etc., etc. I call it industrial policy versus the STI policy, science, technology, and innovation policy. How to sequence them, how to relate those two sets of policies together. Are they the same thing like maybe Mario was hinting, or are they different you know, beasts? How they should be, you know, thought of together, or how they should be sequenced. Number two, in the new context, if we are talking about the new industrial policy, is it the same from the perspectives of developing countries versus the developed countries? Now the EU has its own industrial policy, which is to me STI policy, or to the others it's horizontal policy. The questions that are asked in the context of EU must be very different than, let's say, the questions asked in the case of Kenya, was it, or whatever. So these three factors or other factors, do they look different from the perspectives of different sets of countries? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have to race here, and I myself have a million questions, so I think we have a pending appointment for, I hope it's not in 2 years, but we need to follow up because there's a huge amount of content here, and of course, a lot of technical stuff that needs a good explanation. But let's just take you down the row and give you about a minute to take up, just choose what you would like to respond to and to reflect on. We will be cut off really in 10 minutes. Daniel.
Great, okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much to all the panel. So my first reaction, maybe how it relates to trade. I think that's one of the important things. In the past, trade, industrial policy was immediately associated with protectionism. I think that is one of the elements that is very different. But besides that, that I think that we would all agree with that conclusion that industrial policy is not equivalent to protectionism. I don't think that we have reached a definition of industrial policy. You know? So if we walk out of this door and we're being asked, give me your definition of industrial policy, I'm sure we're all going to give a different definition. And I think that's interesting. Very briefly, my responses to some of the questions. I do think that the framework of thinking about market failures is pretty broad and pretty rich to think about these issues. Coming back to the intervention of our friend from Brazil, for instance, from the Ministry of Planning, with respect to FDI going into natural resource centers. I interpret that as a market failure in the sense that the social gains, the social benefits from FDI into alternative sectors is different from the social gains, the private gains into the natural resource sector. So I think that we can think through the market failure framework to rationalize all those things. And I think I find that helpful, at least maybe it's because of my upbringing, but I think that's a helpful way to think about it. The question about the public policy objectives, right? In a sense, the examples you gave, I think that they are also good examples of market failures. We have under-provision of education, under-provision of basic STI. So I think that again, there we have market failures. I worry a little with the reaction of saying that, industrial policy does not have to be rationalized in this way. Then my question is how to rationalize it. I feel very uncomfortable with a reply that, it's just the whims of whoever is in government. Alejandro Jara had the response to that. It's the democratic process. So as long as we are transparent and saying, hey, we government, democratically elected, have decided to put all our efforts into the energy sector, and that's our choice. And the opportunity cost is not putting that money into cars, into whatever else they could have invested in. Then that's fine. That could be one of the replies. But I would like to have a little more of economic rationality behind that choice. I think that's not an unreasonable thing to ask, and it could lead to investments and to industrial policy that results in more social benefits, and the social maximizing social benefits should be kind of the goal. And finally, to conclude, I think that the open question that I thought was really interesting is about the international spillovers that both you and Alejandro Jara raised. And that I think is a question that has been completely unexplored.
Yeah.
So I would like more there.
Yeah. And this is where we probably want post-MC11, the discussion to go as well in the trade system. Mario, a 60-second minute. Right.
Te quiero mucho.
Try another one. that you can try later on.
No, I want to be very clear. I don't know. I think. Sorry, but I am really worried about the structure of our thinking about industrial policy. I think industrial policy, one of the most important things that you have behind industrial policy is political economy. It's power, rent, distribution, and prices. And that is very important in Latin America too. The example that Renato said about natural resources that is arriving on this sector is a problem that they have the region of how managing macro variables, prices, exchange rate, and so on. Sorry, but if you don't take that, you can understand because you have a lock-in process on natural resources. That's my first point. About your question, and that I think is another important point about science and technology and innovation. It's very difficult to make a difference between the industrial policy and innovation policy. You know? Scientific policy is one thing, but innovation have to be really put it together with industrial policy. It's crucial. One more on this day. What's happening in this region is that the average expenditure on research and development is 0.4. It's quite nothing. You understand? This is a signal of the activity of industrial policy that is very poor. And it's an important thing. We say that for many years. We need more than that. Of course, have to be more efficient, of course, but we need to support innovation. We have countries like China that is about 2.5. Sorry, I was wrong about I want not so specific as in China. No, but you know, it's 3 points. Europe is moving now. With I think. I don't know, really, if we think with the orthodox view on industrial policy, market failure, be careful of how market behave, of course, we can understand countries that did catching up. China did catching up. Korea did catching up. Europe with the Marshall Plan did catching up. And you don't tell me now, please, come on, that Europe will have what Europe have today with no industrial policy and public firms and infant industry technology policy. Don't tell me that it's not because you don't recognize history. This is my point. Of course, trade is crucial. Trade is very important. You can do it without trade, but we have to rethink honestly on that point. I think it's an important debate because many in policy, when you speak with a policy making you better than me, you have to put this point on the table for me.
Thank you.
30 seconds. So for short, I think industry policy is more about, in terms of its outcome, more about whether the policy level playing fields for all market participants to correcting market failure and also fulfilling public policy goals. It's not only about that. So in this sense, that's why China's policy, recent policy, has worried foreign competitors in the sense that they are feel whether there is an unfair advantage, and they will lose business, not just in China, but also in other areas in the world.
Thank you, and Rebecca.
Absolutely. So just to build on that point, I wanted to address your question about international spillovers, and particularly as we see them in science, technology, and innovation. These are goods that are virtually borderless. I know some countries have tried their best to control their technology borders, but by and large, it's very hard to control a digital commodity. As you can see with Bitcoin, what happens when you try to control something. So with respect to that, what does it mean to have an industrial policy centered around STI? What it generally means is that there is going to be some sort of preference for the national industry. Now, we can debate whether that's a good thing or not, but the ultimate result of that is that international companies are going to be more wary about going into that market. And it has nothing to do with immediate economic loss or any sort of obvious competitive disadvantage. What is more insidious about it, I know it's a strong word, but it's true, is that you have technology transfer over time. And so the expectation is that when you go into this market with this industrial policy, that you're going to have to give over some of your IP and not cry foul about it in the courts. I think that is detrimental to global trade. I think it leads to distrust between different parties within different countries, and that's something that needs to be considered when a country is instituting an STI industrial policy.
Gustavo?
Thank you. So, because the discussion focused on where do we go with new industrial policies, I think what's new is not reshape what we try, but do something more radical. And I think that's where we are at. We're working on a space where we're saying to government, build policies that don't compete with private enterprise, build policies that continue to focus on education, skill development, communities that are growing up that have a lot of an abundance of natural resources and yet are not tapping into brain factoring. There's a lot of discussion here of manufacturing, but how little do we discuss about how do we get training and education so people can capitalize on their brain power and liaise at a global scale. My concluding point here would be that for our country, for Canada, we want policies that will focus more on enabling us to commercialize our own innovations. So our innovations are directly linked to our ability to create something within the country based on everything that we do and all of the input at a global scale. So it's no longer a Canadian innovation per se, or an American or a Chinese innovation, but it's the ability of one particular country or team enabled by government policies to be able to compete. And when you get that, that's where you actually come out as a winner. I once again thank you, Ricardo, for a fantastic panel.
Thank you, Colette. Thank you, Gustavo. Now let's go to Colette and we finish this. Sorry.
No problem.
This happens when you're running, Colette.
Really quickly, I'll address the de facto policy space question. What I mean with de facto policy space is essentially anything a country can get away with without experiencing repercussions under the WTO. But as a wrinkle to that is that in reality, the policy space, the de facto policy space of a given developing country is typically narrower than if you were to look just at the WTO. Take, for example, the second-hand clothing industry issue. For those of you who followed it, East African community wanted to adopt an import ban on second-hand clothing from the US. And the US said, well, that's not going to happen. And they then said, we will review your AGOA eligibility if you're going to go through with that. So there, the industrial policy space, the de facto space, is narrowed as a result of the trade preference scheme on which Kenya, as one country, is dependent. So that's essentially how I use the terms. Thanks for the question, and thanks for the panel.
Thank you, and thank you for that, for being that brief. So, so again, it's a bit frustrating because we got incredibly good presentations, a lot of material to think about, and an incredible amount of material to talk and discuss about. And we need to really figure it out how to provide input to the policymakers from our side when they design policy and that trade and investment policies and frameworks, particularly of the future. And we, of course, didn't touch upon all the aspects of industrial policy. That would have been impossible. There's much more, even than what we heard about. But I'm very happy that we got as much, and we got some of the differences of perspectives and thought on these issues. We will continue to work on them. Thank you all very much. You're all invited now to what we call a welcome session, which is starting, I think, immediately after this panel downstairs. So thank you all very much.